There are lots of stories of the police enlisting the assistance of psychics to uncover evidence or even solve major cases that otherwise might have gone cold. And one of the main theories put forth as to why spirits still inhabit the mortal realm is the possibility that they may have some unfinished business to tend to. Because there's nothing more traumatic than when a life is taken suddenly, without warning, or for no rhyme or reason. This next story combines elements of true crime and the paranormal, and I think you'll find it extremely strange. Teresita Basa was employed as a respiratory therapist at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago. She had graduated from Loyola University and was highly regarded and adored by family, classmates, and co-workers. When she was brutally murdered in February of 1977, it sent her colleagues, loved ones, and the local community into a state of shock and grief. There was no resolution into who killed Teresita until months later, when her case was reopened, largely based on new leads that were put forth by her ghost. The only child of a wealthy couple who was born and raised in the Philippines, Teresita graduated from Assumption College in Manila before emigrating to the United States in 1960 with plans to earn a master's degree in music studies from Indiana University. Soon, however, she embarked on a different path by entering the field of medicine, specifically training to become a respiratory therapist. In 1977, at the age of 47, she was working at the famed Edgewood Hospital in Chicago, which is also where notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy and former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton were born, and they also had Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe listed among its former patients. Not entirely giving up her love of music, she continued her studies toward a doctorate at Loyola. She also gave piano lessons to neighborhood children inside her home. It was a cold morning on February 21st as Teresita left to start her shift at the hospital, and after a typical day returned home, where she received a phone call at around 7:30 that night from her close friend Ruth Loeb. They spoke for about 20 minutes before Teresita announced she was expecting a male visitor that night. Not asking the man's name or any details about the visit, Ruth said goodbye and the phone call ended. A short time later, around 8:40 p.m., her neighbors Marit and Catherine Nazi, who lived down the hall from her, smelled the unmistakable scent of smoke permeating the apartment building, though they couldn't determine where it was coming from. Becoming quite concerned, they summoned the building custodian, who quickly called the Chicago Fire Department and began the process of evacuating the residents. When firefighters arrived, they saw the entire hallway where the Nazis lived was filled with smoke. Realizing it was emanating from apartment 15B, which was where Teresita lived, they broke down the door and from there quickly extinguished the fire. But once it was brought under control and the smoke began to clear, they came upon a horrifying sight. On the floor they saw a mattress, under which lay Teresita's naked body, with a kitchen knife plunged through her chest. Realizing their initial response to a fire was now a murder scene, detectives were called in. Upon arrival, it was abundantly clear that the fire was set to destroy any evidence from the crime. After she had been stabbed, her clothing was removed, thrown on top of the mattress, and set afire. Assuming she may have also been the victim of rape, it was somewhat puzzling that her body showed no signs of sexual assault, leaving investigators perplexed as to the motive behind her death. Despite the lack of physical evidence, there were signs of a struggle, as it was clear her apartment had been ransacked, but there was no way of knowing if anything had been taken from it, as Teresita lived by herself. Nonetheless, a robbery could not be ruled out at that point. Combing for clues that might provide more insight into what took place there, all that presented itself was a note that Teresita had written herself at some unknown point, which simply read, "Get theater tickets for AS." The urgency now for detectives would be to find out who AS was. Investigators in the Homicide Division started the process of interviewing as many neighbors, classmates, co-workers, and friends as they could possibly find. All described Teresita as a highly committed employee and a very quiet type who was a darling of staff and patients alike. Never married and not in a relationship at the time of her death, she was nonetheless known to go out on the occasional date and seemed content to focus on her job and her music studies. She had no enemies anyone could think of, and it was beyond comprehension that anyone would take her life. While a clear picture of her and her life had been painted for the detectives, the lack of evidence surrounding her murder was frustrating. A hotline was set up for anyone having any information on the killing, but there were very few responses, and of those, none cast any more light on her death. It seemed at that point the case was destined to go cold, as a few months passed with nothing to provide a direction to go in. It was becoming very clear that her murder may likely go unsolved, and her killer remaining at large. This would change in July of that year, as Detective Joe Stakula reported for work and found a note on his desk requesting he call the Evanston Police Department to discuss the case. When he immediately did so, a detective there informed him they had received a call from Dr. Jose Chua, who resided in Skokie, Illinois, who claimed he may have pertinent information about the case. Stakula and his partner, Detective Lee Eplin, met with Dr. Chua at his home, and as he began to tell his story, the investigators were floored with what he revealed. A very reticent and somewhat uncomfortable Dr. Chula at one point asked them if either believed in the occult or the supernatural. As both investigators exchanged sideways glances at each other, likely wondering what kind of crazy, useless information they were about to receive from this stranger, they masked their skepticism and heard him out. Awkwardly, Dr. Chula told them that he believed his wife Remy was being possessed by the spirit of Teresita Basa. It seemed Remy, who was also from the Philippines, had begun having very strange dreams about Teresita. At first attempting to just ignore them, it became clear one night that approach was no longer possible. Dr. Chua told of her being fast asleep and in a voice not her own calling out his name. She looked to be in his words, some sort of trance. Becoming more frightened of what was taking place, he heard the unfamiliar voice cry out that she was Teresita Basa, and she needed his help. Even more startling was the information that began to be put forth, most remarkably stating the name of her killer, Alan Showery, and that Dr. Chua must bring this to the police's attention. It was commonly known that Basa would sometimes pay Showery to do odd jobs around her apartment, as she knew he needed the extra money. Remy, or Teresita, then explained that Showery had come over to fix her TV set, but it all somehow ended in him killing her. She told Dr. Chow there was no need to fear and implored him to contact the police and give them the information, after which time her voice simply faded away. A now fully awakened Remy had no knowledge of what had just transpired, and when her husband recounted what she, or Teresita, had told him, she was astounded and had a difficult time comprehending what had just occurred. Initially, Dr. Chua elected to just forget it all happened, but a week later, when Remy was not quite herself and going through an emotional time after losing her job at the hospital, the entire incident repeated itself. While she was asleep, Teresita spoke through Remy once again, but this time the voice took on a different tone, one of urgency and anger. Demanding to know why the doctor had done nothing to help her to this point, Chua struck up a conversation telling her he needed proof before he took the dramatic step of accusing a man of murder. Now becoming even more angry, Teresita told him in no uncertain terms, if it's proof he wanted, that's what he would have. Then there was a third contact made, and this time the voice of Teresita went into greater detail, telling him that just after Showery took her life and before he set the fire, he took jewelry from her apartment that her father had given her, and that the items had originally been bought in France as a gift to her mother. She went on to say Showery then went on to give them to his girlfriend. As if that was not specific enough, she also provided names and numbers of people who would substantiate her story about the jewelry. She also said the sexual assault had been staged, which was not public information at that time. At this point, Dr. Chua put aside his own skepticism and the potential for humiliation and took the leap of faith to contact the Evansville PD with the information. After hearing this and trying to process what they had just heard, Detectives Stachula and Eplin decided there was nothing to lose in pursuing the lead, as there was little else to go on, especially since Alan Showery's initials matched those found on the note in Teresita's apartment, AS. They immediately conducted a background check on Alan Showery. It was now time for the detectives to visit with Showery and get a feel for him. They went to his apartment, where he was there with his girlfriend Yanka Kamluk, who was pregnant at the time. They engaged in some idle chat before they asked him to come with them to police headquarters. Setting the stage, they informed him they were investigating the murder of Teresita Basa, and because they knew each other, were looking for any kind of information he might contribute to their case. Showery enthusiastically agreed to do so. But slowly his deception began to unravel. At first he denied ever visiting Basa's apartment, but the detectives informed him that workers at the hospital had overheard him talking about going there to fix her TV. Suddenly, Showery remembered indeed going there, but not having the right tool for the job, told her he would come back another time to take care of it. With that, he said he left her place and went directly home to address some electrical issues in his own apartment. It was then, despite their initial misgivings, that the detectives started to believe this might be their guy. So they returned to Alan's apartment so they could have a talk with his girlfriend. Speaking with Yanka, she informed them she wasn't aware of any electrical problems there, and besides, electrical issues, in her opinion, wouldn't be Alan's strong point. Then it was game, set, and match, when they asked Yanka if she had gotten any jewelry from Alan, to which she responded she had received a pearl ring and a jade pendant back in February as a belated Christmas gift, and that, in fact, she was wearing the pendant as they spoke. They then asked her to accompany them back to the station, to which she agreed. After she arrived there, the detectives arranged for everyone who may be able to identify the jewelry as Teresita's to join them as well. Initially, Showery denied any wrongdoing, but when the items were positively identified as Basa's, he confessed to killing her. Explaining what took place that evening, Showery claimed his plan was to steal anything valuable in order to pay his rent. Under the guise of fixing her TV, he was allowed into the apartment. She planned to give him the theater tickets as a thank you. When she turned her back to him, he attacked her and tore off her clothing to make it look like a sexual assault. He then stabbed her in the chest. His goal of a big score came up short, as he only found $30 cash in the apartment, so took the jewelry essentially to at least make the killing worth his while. He then set the fire to eliminate any evidence left behind. Showery was charged with murder, but would later retract his confession, saying police had threatened to arrest the pregnant Kalmuk if he didn't. William Swano, his lawyer, also called for the charges to be dismissed, claiming his arrest was based on nothing more than a ghost story. Swano said, quote, "Never to my knowledge has a man been arrested because of a supernatural vision. police have never before been informed of a criminal's name by a voice from the grave. Despite his protests, the presiding judge decided how Remy came to this information was not as relevant as the fact that it led to Showery as the perpetrator. So he ordered the case to trial, which took place on January 21st of 1979. The jury could not reach a consensus, so a mistrial was declared, and while the case went to retrial, Showery spent that time in prison. While there awaiting the retrial, Showery chose to plead guilty in order to get his sentence reduced, and as a result was given 14 years for first-degree murder, 4 years for arson, and another 4 for robbery. There is an unfounded rumor that his change of heart happened only after Teresita's spirit visited him while he was incarcerated. More likely as he did this after consulting with his lawyer. Attempting to discredit Remy Chua, Showery's lawyers floated the idea that Remy had actually killed Teresita, who had, in fact, sold Showery the jewelry. Chua concocted the possession angle only after losing her job at the hospital. But this was never truly considered to be a serious argument. Alan Showery only served 5 years before being released on parole. Now, there are some details to this story that might explain how this all came to pass, and I'll present them to you in order for you to make up your own minds as to whether the spirit of Teresita Basa truly solved her own murder. It's said that Remy and Teresita had met previously at the hospital, and for a time both worked there as respiratory therapists, albeit on different shifts, so their paths rarely crossed. Remy also worked with Alan Showery, and it was reported by some that neither thought very highly of the other, and that perhaps she had overheard him speaking of his plans to visit her apartment. Remy has vehemently denied the idea that she faked this possession in order to perhaps protect herself rather than just going to authorities and risk being named as his accuser. It's also certainly possible that the connection that Remy had to Teresita transcended chance meetings and overheard conversations. Both had come to America from the Philippines, both held the same positions at the same hospital, both spoke Tagalog as well as English, and both knew Alan Showery. Now, whether or not Remy Chua truly connected with the spirit of Teresita Basa remains a subject of some debate. But a key element here is Remy or Teresita's contention that the sexual assault was hoaxed, because that information had not been released by the police. So is it within the realm of possibility that Teresita found Remy to be something of a kindred spirit because of their cultural background and their shared experiences? It was reported by her husband that at times the voice of Teresita spoke in Tagalog as well as English. So perhaps there was a spiritual bond between the women that existed, even though they barely knew each other. But what is not debatable is, in the end, Teresita Basa's murderer was brought to justice based on the information provided by Remy Chua, which proved to be unassailably accurate.